Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Remember to smash that like and subscribe button below after this video on human development. I feel like that could maybe be mildly amusing for 3 seconds, but that would quickly get irritating if I continue that. So yeah, let's jump into theories of human development. Chapter preview and theories. We already talked about this in the last chapter. So the idea here is theories are sets of ideas. They guide the collection of new facts and observation. And I'm just adding here, what is learned in science greatly depends on which theories are dominant in that historical era. So theories I mean science in general, are always reflective of whatever a culture is valuing at that particular time. Theories often reflect dominant cultures, dominant political theories, dominant economic theories, dominant, aka how we conceptualize humanity, human behavior. Um, those conceptualizations are always reflective of a particular historical era. So nature, nurture, we already talked about this. You know, it's the beauty of some textbooks. Just how much do biological and environmental forces affect human development, and they interact dynamically is the takeaway here. All right, let's jump into something new here. Components of theories, activity versus passivity. Extent to which human beings are active in producing their own development or are passively shaped. Activity, humans are an active species, orchestrates their own development through exploration and shaping their environment. Passivity, humans are passive recipients of environmental factors. Development is shaped largely by forces beyond their control. So activity, I mean, pretty straightforward. It's active. Um, you are acting on the world. You are exploring. You are running into things. You are learning, and that is how we develop. Versus passivity, you live in a household. Everyone in your household is depressed, so you're going to be depressed, and then therefore your biological, neurological, whatever genetic expression, your development at large will reflect that passive uh, reception of your household depression. Continuity and discontinuity. Is development change gradual or abrupt? Is it quantitative or qualitative? So we have gradual or abrupt. You get a little taller each year, a little better at reading. Or one day your kid starts talking. Quantitative, the degree of change, versus qualitative, the change in kind slash fundamental. And you can see this to your left. You have two approaches, gradual and quantitative, kind of just going kind of like at a slope, going uphill. You're just grinding, chugging away. You're developing a little, versus abrupt, a more step process, a qualitative shift in an individual, a psychological process, whatever. Continuity theorists argue for gradual and quantitative, and discontinuity theorists argue for abrupt and qualitative change. They focus on developmental stages. So at each stage or step in the ladder or hypothetical ladder, you're acquiring a whole new set of skills that did not exist prior to being at that stage slash step. All right, another component, universality versus context specificity. Uh, the extent to which developmental changes are universal or different across cultures, theorists argue theorized stages are universal. Competing theorists argue pathways of development vary depending on context. So, continuing on with our previous slide, or kind of building on that. So you have stage theorists. So you've got a whole new set of abilities at each stage. Well, stage theorists argue that these kind of these steps, these stages represent universal human processes. You hit a certain age, you hit a certain milestone, and bam, you got all these abilities. And because it's this kind of stage process, it's universal. It's kind of an innate species trait versus specificity, which is, development depends on the context. So I included an article here, The Development of Executive Functioning Theory of Mind, a comparison of Chinese and US preschoolers. So I'm not going to get into the specific constructs right now, but theory of mind, just kind of an executive function, it doesn't matter. These are two psychological constructs that are thought to be universal. So let's look at this article real quickly. We're not going to read the whole thing, but I just highlighted some parts of it. So we looked at US preschoolers and preschoolers from Beijing. The Chinese preschoolers outperformed the US counterparts on all measures of executive functioning, but were not similarly advanced in theory of mind reasoning. Nonetheless, individual differences in executive functioning predicted theory of mind for children in both cultures. So the idea here is that the authors are arguing that executive function precedes theory of mind. So it's kind of the stage process. You get executive function, and then you get theory of mind. Broadly speaking, I'm just trying to keep this simple as possible. So there's this universal stage, right? But they're finding that Chinese preschoolers perform better on executive function tasks. So that shows kind of even within this universal process, as proposed by these authors, there's still those processes are still influenced by culture, aka whatever's going on in China, which is detailed in the article, in this particular preschool that allows them to outperform American preschoolers on this executive function task. But interestingly, not on the theory of mind task. So authors will argue that some psychological constructs are more universal or more influenced by the environment than others. Okay, let's look at one theory, psychoanalytic theory. This focuses on the development of personality. People are driven by primarily unconscious motives and emotional conflicts, unaware of these motives and conflicts, and shaped by the earliest experience of the family. So we're going to highlight one particular theorist who everybody knows, and that is Freud. So anytime you kind of bring up Freud, well, not at any time at all. Fun fact, way over exaggerated. But once in a while, you bring up Freud, and students will ask, why are we reading this? Why are we studying this? If a lot of his claims have been found false. Well, there's a lot of reasons. One reason is that even when you take a biology class or kind of any medical class or neuropsychology class, I took a neurobio class, you learn about the history of science, of development. We learn about, theories of illness prior to germ theory, whatever, some kind of chemicals being in your blood and the incorrect of amount of these magical chemicals in your blood creating illness, etc. And it also allows, so we learn historic, this kind of historical process by which we are to where we are now. And it kind of allows a student an opportunity to begin to critically evaluate researchers in the field. And this is kind of like a safe example. It's not as modern, and you can kind of see some issues with it. So it really practices those critical thinking skills, as well as kind of understanding that where we are right now as a field, a scholarship, is based on what came before us. It's that history. So with that said, let's jump into this. He's a psychoanalytic theorist, emphasized biological instincts, innate biological forces that motivates behavior. He looked at unconscious motivation, first 5 years of life experience, and 3 stages of the personality, 5 stages of psychosocial development. So let's look at this again. So one also good point is that Freud is still very relevant. I just threw Freud into Amazon, you get 10,000 results. So the big takeaways here is that behavior, our development, our personality is developed through forces beyond our control and through the environment within the first 5 years of life. That shapes your entire lifelong process, and it's mostly unconscious to every individual. So there's 3 parts to Freud's theory, this kind of psychic energy. You got the id, ego, superego, id, kind of your irrational selfish part. It wants that spicy chicken sandwich right now. Versus ego, which is kind of a rational side of the individual involved in logical reasoning, and superego, which kind of balances the two. Psychosexual stages. I'm not going to read this. I don't really need you to memorize the specific years or anything along that line. So, looking at the strength and limitations of Freud theories. Limitations of Freud theory. How do you test the id, superego, and ego? How do you falsify it? So, if I can't operationally define it, if I can't, locate the superego part of the brain, for example, how can I test that this is real, that he's correct? How can you falsify it? Its strength is that it emphasizes the role of unconscious processes, which we know are a dominant part of humanity. Early life experiences have been found to predict future behaviors, and emotions affect behaviors. All right, now let's look at Erickson's psychosocial theory. He was a neo-Freudian. He focused on personality, argued personality develops through systematic changes, less emphasis on sexual urges, more emphasis on social influence. So, kind of the big differences here is that he looked at and was interested in the role of social influences in lifelong development. It wasn't just the first 5 years of life. And he was way less interested in sexual urges. So if it's like any question, if the question is, hey, something dealing with anything sex related, it's going to be Freud. So that's a little tip for studying. Erickson laid out a series of 8 psychosocial developmental stages. So going back to that stages keyword. And the idea here is that at each stage, an individual faces a crisis. And at each age, you advance to kind of a new stage. And even though you may have not developed or resolved the crisis within a particular stage, you still advance to the next stage. And issues arise when you really don't solve the crisis, but you're leveling up, you're advancing to the next stage. So that kind of like lingering effects affect you for your life. So kind of lifelong developmental issues arise from unresolved crises within these psychosocial development stages. Strengths and weaknesses. Humans aren't pure antisocial trash. Freud had a much more negative view, not as much as I'm saying, but he had a much more negative view of humanity. Biology and social environments interact to form personality. So more emphasis on social environmental factors. Weaknesses, how do you operationally define stages? Kind of similar to the Freud thing. Both Freud and Erickson focus on describing personality development, not explaining how personality develops. So they're looking at each stage, X, Y, Z happens, but why is it happening? What are these processes that are underlying the progression of these stages, and what is the purpose of these stages? So now in history, we have reached the learning theorist. A couple we're going to highlight. The first one is John Watson. He described it as behaviorism, which is kind of confusing because that term means something different right now, and so but whatever. We're gonna ride with behaviorism. Psychologists should theorize on and make conclusions based on observable behavior, reject the psychoanalytical theory. So he was like, okay, yeah, that all that psychic energy shit, it's like I'm gonna ignore it. I'm not about that life. Hashtag who cares. We're gonna look at things that are just observable, and that is our study of human behavior / psychology. Okay, let's look at classical conditioning. It's a form of learning in which a stimulus comes to elicit a response through its association with a stimulus that already elicits a response. Pavlov, fear of emotional response is not inborn but learned. So this is the classic Pavlov experiment. If you have a dog or know of the concept of dogs like eating human foods. They like meat. So if there's meat around, if there's food, you got a cheeseburger, that dog is going to react biologically to that cheeseburger by drooling, for example. Well, so that's an automatic response that already exists within that dog. What you can do then is, because that automatic response already exists, anytime you show a cheeseburger, which the dog already loves, and you ring a bell, the dog is going to associate, oh, bell with cheeseburger. Thus, fears and emotional responses are not inborn but learned. For example, another example, little Albert. This is like this seminal study. The idea here was that little Albert, I people debate what the animal was, but it was like a bunny or a rat or something. And he loved the bunny slash rat. At the beginning of an experiment. So this little kid, little Albert, loves bunny slash rat. Well, what's in this experiment, what was done was, and Watson did this, was every time the child was shown a bunny slash rat, whatever it was, he would just nail this like gong and make this abrupt, really loud noise, and it would freak the kid out, right? So over time, the kid became to associate this bunny with this like just getting your eardrums like destroyed. So anytime the child saw a bunny after X amount of trials, he would start crying. Or it wasn't only just the bunny slash rat. It was like toys and even kind of like things that remotely resembled uh, that bunny slash rat. So whatever, the toy rat or like something fuzzy. That was the idea here. Now, the extent to which that is all accurate, that's kind of the classic story. But with all these seminal studies from years ago, poor documentation, poor controls, don't exactly know who little Albert is, etc. So, but that's kind of the idea we're working with here. So, learning theorists, development is a continuous process of behavior change. Does not go through biological based distinct stages. Context specific development can be radically different. So, because learning is based on, or I should say, behavior is based on learning. It's automatically going to be context specific, and people are going to have different kind of developmental trajectories, and not like these universal stages. Okay, let's look at another famous learning theorist, Skinner, and behavioralism. Focuses on uncovering the general laws slash basic principles of learning by looking outside the organism. Inputs, outputs, rewards, punishments. People repeat behaviors with desirable consequences and decrease behaviors with undesirable consequences. Skinner claimed that free will is but an illusion. And I'm not going to read the entire little blurb here, but kind of the idea is what I alluded to a few slides ago, and that is, this psychic id stuff is nonsense. How biology, how physics advances as science was looking at these specific observable things, and psychology in my opinion, psychologists should limit what it is they study to these specific things. And what are these specific things? Well, one example is this classic little rat thing. So you put a rat in here and put up a couple buttons, and every time the rat presses a button, he gets food, and then you just uh, can calculate how many times the rat pushes that button, how often, for example, how quickly, and then draw from this rat box um, the truths of human development. So human development is literally just a series of input and outputs, rewards and punishments. So we have two types of reinforcement that I'm going to look at here. Reinforcement is when a consequence strengthens a response or makes it more likely to occur. Positive reinforcement event that makes that event more probable, plus plus. So the idea here is, and this is Zach George, a wonderful dog trainer on YouTube. Check it out, link in the description box, / note box. So he's training his dog how to not freak out in the kennel. So what he's doing is every time the dog puts any feet into the kennel, he throws a little kibble. So he's increasing or attempting to increase the behavior that he wants, aka staying in the kennel and not freaking out. So to do so, to increase enjoying the kennel, you give them a reward that they like, a plus. So it's plus. You give kibble to increase happiness in the kennel. Kibble plus kennel. Negative reinforcement. Behavior is strengthened because something unpleasant is removed or is avoided after the behavior occurs. So example here is if I really wanted to eat a Burger King spicy chicken sandwich, but I know I have horrible acid reflux. But I'm like, screw it, I'm getting 2 spicy chicken sandwiches. The idea here is that acid reflex is going to hold me back from getting what I deserve, and that's 2 spicy chicken sandwiches. So what I do is I take an antacid pill. So in this case, the antacid is reducing my acid reflex. So it's acting as a negative reinforcement. So taking that antacid reduces my acid reflex and increases my ability to eat spicy chicken sandwiches. So it's a plus and a minus. So let's look at punishment. Punishment decreases the strength of the behavior. So that's the difference here. While reinforcement is increasing a desired behavior, punishment seeks to decrease a behavior. So positive punishment. Unpleasant stimulus is the consequence of a behavior. So if Zach George, our dog trainer from the previous slide, say the dog was whining in a kennel, and his solution is to kick the dog in the face. So he's providing a punishment to decrease the dog whining. Negative punishment. Desirable stimulus is removed following the behavior. So say a child is playing NBA 2K on PS5 and they suck, so they're screaming at the top of their lungs, and the parents is like, hey, it's 3 in the morning, and then they just take their PlayStation 5 away and throw it outside. So you're removing that stimulus away, aka you're taking away the PS5, so the kid shuts up. And here's a table detailing this in more detail. So let's look at Bandura, social cognitive theory. RIP, just died recently, so RIP to a legend. Social cognitive theory, humans are cognitive beings whose active processing of information plays a critical role in their learning, behavior, and development. Rat learning is very different from human learning because of humans' advanced cognitive skills. Humans anticipate what will happen if they perform a behavior, self-criticize, and have different motivations. They partake in observational learning, learning by observing some people. So he is arguing that, yeah, rats may be able to do this, but guess what? Humans are way more complex. They will self-criticize. So it's not just this stimulus input output situation, is that humans in their brain, we know this, they have different motivations. They will, have imposter syndrome or whatever. They will have anxiety, and that will drive behavior often. Also, he argued for observational learning. So the Bobo doll experiment is kind of, again, famous experiment. And what they did was they had two groups of children. One group of children watched adults just like beat the hell out of this inflatable doll. And the other group, I don't know what they did, but just say they had tea and crumpets with them. Well, the children who watched the doll get the hell beat out of it by its parents, when they interacted with the doll, they were more likely to beat the hell out of that doll. And the children who saw the parents have tea and crumpets with the doll were more likely to, I don't know, play nicely with the doll. So the idea here is they are learning by observing. There was no reinforcement there. It was just that they were watching elders, adults, parents, caregivers, whoever, acting in a certain way, and then they learn from it. So one interesting phenomenon is imitation learning. Over-imitation is the tendency to imitate every detail of what they say model do, even when actions are useless in achieving a goal. And this is seen cross-culturally. So the idea here, say you give a child some kind of contraption they've never seen before, some box, and they watch a adult do a tumble. They're breakdancing, whatever. They're doing the Dougie. And every time before they open the box. Well, the child will actually imitate all that nonsense before opening the box. And even if that adult isn't in the room, they'll still imitate it. So they're picking up on every little detail that the caregiver, the experiment, or whatever is doing to open the box. And why does that happen? Because it's possibly an adaptive for our species. It's an intergenerational transmission of arbitrary rules, rituals, and problem-solving skills, copycat effect. So, we have culture and we have just random shit that we make up that we think is useful. It's arbitrary rules, rituals. And one way that that's passed down is by children imitating. And often, and then experimenters can manipulate that and just make it, ridiculous and do all kinds of gestures before performing a task. And you can see that in the video. So now I want to highlight one other point here, and that's latent learning. Learning occurs, but is not evident in behavior. Competence for performance. Competence is what we know. Performance is showing what we know. So the idea here is that just because we'll say a rat or a human, in this case, we're looking at rats, are not demonstrating a behavior, does that mean that they don't actually know the behavior, or are they just, or do they know it and are not performing it? So there's kind of, again, this famous study that implies that reinforcement is not necessary for learning to occur. And I just grabbed this classic chart, and I'm not going to go through the whole study, but the idea here is that just look at the yellow or orange, and what line are we looking at here? Blue line. See how the orange line / yellowish, mostly orange line, is performing better than the blue lines. That is, they're scoring less errors for a day in the maze. And that's because it was thought that, okay, yeah, they're always getting reinforced. These rats in the orange line are always getting reinforced, but the blue line people are not getting reinforced. But what they did is they had that blue line, that group of rats, watch the orange group perform the maze successfully. Well, once the reinforcement began on the 11th day, aka whatever, 11 days after watching the other group of rats, that orange group who's always getting reinforced, after they get reinforced one time, look how rapidly their errors decrease, because they already knew and had memorized the maze. They just didn't care enough to perform for the maze. So they already knew. So the idea here is that latent learning can occur free of reinforcement, and it challenges the radical kind of behaviorist idea that only inputs and outputs are how learning in development occurs. So strengths and weaknesses of learning theories. Strengths. Theories are testable in extremely controlled settings and improves rigor. So you can put that rat in that cage, and you can give it as much cocaine and food as you want. You're in control of that environment. Weaknesses. Too little emphasis on biological influences. So, for example, instinctive drift, the tendency for animals to return to their natural behaviors following repeated reinforcement. So, kind of a famous study is that this raccoons, they'll hold automatically if you give them something to hold. Those kind of start like rubbing their hands with it. Well, experimenters tried to reinforce behavior that was kind of antithetical to that biological urge. So they were trying to reinforce the tendency to not do this. Well, what ended up happening is that that animal would always go back to doing that hand motion because it was kind of embedded within their biology. So they could not reinforce that away. Even if they learned it temporarily, eventually they would go back to rubbing their hands together. And questionable assumptions. I'm not going to read this, but it's kind of a funny beef if you ever want to read it. Skinner versus Chomsky, who we'll cover later, and him kind of just making fun of Skinner through academic articles. So, and then Skinner replies, of course. So it's always a fun little beef to look at. Piaget, he is famous for constructivism. Intelligence is a process that helps an organism adapt to its environment. Through development, humans acquire increasingly complex cognitive structures that aid in adaptation. Children are not born with innate ideas about reality. Children are not formed with information by adults. So the big points here are that, and they reflect his biological background, that intelligence is useful because it helps an individual adapt to the environment. And children don't have inborn ideas about the world, but they interact with the world. They construct the world through their actions, which is how they develop. So let's expand on that. As I said, children construct their own understandings of the world based on experiences. They're curious and active explorers. So in that implicit in that theory, and I want you to kind of take that approach for a lot of these theories, what is it that they're saying about humanity, each one of these theories? So implicit, and he argues quite explicitly, that humans, that children are naturally curious and active explorers because you're constructing your world, right? So you have to have an active exploring species. So they experiment on objects they encounter and watch what is going on around them. So literally experience shaping their development because they are naturally explorers. Use what they know to solve problems and are able to revise understandings to better fit reality. Interaction is interaction between bio maturation, experience is responsible. Okay, so as children are interacting with the world, they develop and notice that things are inconsistent than their understanding of the world. And as they encounter those inconsistencies, they seek to resolve them. And we'll explain how they resolve them. So 4 stages of cognitive development. Sensory motor stage, pre-operational, concrete, formal operation stage, and each have kind of a set of ages. Children develop logical problem solving, the ability to mentally categorize or add subject or subtract objects, and think more abstractly and hypothetically. In variant sequence, all children progress through the stages in the order they are listed. Each stage is average. All right, so big takeaways here is that each stage, again, he is a stage theorist. So at each stage, you have a qualitative shift in abilities. You acquire whatever it is, the ability to multiply, do calculus, have theory of mind, and ultimately you think more abstractly. And rooted in that ability to think more abstractly is kind of the development in your or a child's ability to mentally categorize objects within the environment or that they're actively interacting with. And we're going to get in more detail of this later on in this course, but this is kind of like a little treat before our big meal. And I'm not going to read this off, but these are the stages. Next is Vygotsky's sociocultural perspective. Cognitive development shaped by sociocultural context occurs and grows out of children's interaction with members of their culture, not universal. Culture, approaches, and problem solving passed down intergenerational. Children are social beings who develop their interactions with wiser members of the culture. So the idea here is the difference between him and Piaget is that it's not just active exploration at this individual kind of egocentric way. It's that through interaction with older, wiser members of your group, extended family, your parents, etc., that you learn certain problem solving approaches, certain ways of thinking, which are culturally based. Therefore, it is not universal. Cultures have different approaches and problem solving skills, and AKA they emphasize particular skills, which are passed intergenerationally. So it's not going to be universal. Embedded within this belief is that humans are social beings and they interact with wiser members of culture. So let's look at one system theorist, Bronfenbrenner. Scientists were studying human development out of context, he argued. Development occurred widely depending on neighborhood and home environment culture. He charged that developmental psychology has become the study of the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time. People are embedded in a series of environmental systems which interact with each other and the individual over time to influence development. Changes arises from ongoing transactions. So basically the idea here is he's criticizing the field of psychology as a whole. He's saying, listen, you guys create specific tasks and put them in these very controlled environments. And yeah, you can find some things, but is that actually relevant to the real world? Is how generalizable is or are your findings in a non-hyper-controlled environment? So that's his question. Well, he argued that development occurs through a series of transactions where the organism, aka the human, and these larger environmental factors are influencing each other. So let's begin to make this a little more concrete. How the environment is organized and how it affects development. That is the bioecosystem model or the ecological systems theories. They have different names. Developing person is embedded in a series of 4 environmental systems, and you can see here is a reasonable illustration of these systems. So we have, these microsystems, so kind of typical things that we understand, family dynamics, interactions, how what the child is actually interacting with on a daily life, in their daily life, especially kind of when they're young. But look how far we can go out. Macro systems, broad ideologies, laws, customs of one's cultures, subcultures, social classes, impacting development. And we kind of understand that at a conceptual level that, the country that you live in impacts your development. And Bronfenbrenner pointed that out. And not only that, but the Chronos system, which changes, which is kind of the historical era effects. So living in a particular historical era will provide individuals with certain technologies, certain values within a particular culture, and just shit. And we understand that kind of intuitively, right? So you can look at the macro system, a set of laws or whatever in a certain country. So in the U.S., the environmental factors were different during World War II. They were different than during 1700s United States. There's a difference between what's particular laws, who they applied to. There was differences between the 1700s and whatever, the 2000s, right? So these are kind of what we would think is kind of common sense, but Bronfenbrenner was bringing these to the table and trying to highlight how this process works. And it's not just that the environment impacts the individual, it's that the individual can change these environments. It's this dynamic interactionist approach to developmental psychology. So let's look at some examples here. Development will be complex because outcomes depend on many factors. Will a parent losing a job be detrimental to a child? Maybe. Historical period is important. The relationships between environments and people change over time. So what do I mean by that? So the impacts of the Great Recession, we have a ton of data on this, for example. The impacts of the Great Depression, the recession of, whatever the exact date is when it started is debated, but, around that 2008, 2007 range. Countries had different human outcomes for that. So different rates of suicide, different rates of depression, etc., different impacts from unemployment. Why is that? Because countries are different. They have different laws, they have different social welfare programs, etc. So the question, will a parent losing a job be detrimental to a child? The answer is maybe. It depends on the historical period. Does Social Security exist yet? Do you live in Denmark, or do you live in where there's many social welfare programs, or do you live in the United States where there's not paid sick leave, for example? So Bronfenbrenner was disenchanted with comparing children at different SES levels. So he argued for a PPCT model, which is process, person, context, and time. So again, kind of just different aspects of that larger ecological system. Over the course of evolution, during individuals' development, genes and environments influence one another and co-act to increase and decrease certain outcomes. So the idea here is that, and then over the course of evolution, during individuals' development, genes and environment influence one another and co-act. Okay, so again, the idea here is that that through this complex interaction between all these different levels and individuals acting within those levels, they can change the law, they can change their family environments, they can change their neighborhoods. Through that kind of mutual dynamic process, probabilities of developmental outcomes occur. So, a common example is of a big hurricane came and wiped out an entire city and wiped out all the schools, all the houses, etc. You have a increased probability of certain negative developmental outcomes to occur within that developmental context in that historical period. And finally, strengths and limitations. Strengths conceptualize development as a product of dynamic interactions. Studies demonstrate that traumatic events can disrupt multiple systems. Considers the role of historical context. Limitation, generalization problems. It depends. Do all developmental outcomes have the same degree? Maybe. So basically, the critique here is Yeah, it's kind of harder. There's not always an answer to does X have a negative impact? Does Y cause X? It depends because these systems are so dynamic. There's so many factors going on in the real world. A person's behavior isn't, I just give you a cookie, therefore you're going to act a certain way. There's all kinds of things going on at their job, in their house, in their neighborhoods, their countries, internationally, whatever. So with that in mind, it's difficult to measure it. How do you measure all those variables in one study? And the answer is it's impossible. So how do you approach that in the best way possible? And that's our last slide. Thank you everyone for listening. I'll see you next week. Have a great week.